Those were the latest updates from Kenya. That was the ground situation. But how did it come to this? Why did the government allow public anger to reach this level? Why did they insist on raising taxes? Despite the obvious opposition from the common people, to put it simply, the government believes it had no choice. It is drowning in a sea of debt, and it is desperate for a lifeline, which is why it resorted to raising taxes. Part of Kenya's debt problem is the government's fault, caused by unchecked borrowing over the last decade. But there's more to the story. You have international lenders tightening the screws, like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. You also have external shocks like COVID and the war in Ukraine, leading to Kenya's currency depreciating. And of course, there's usually one suspicious party when it comes to debt, especially debt in Africa. We're talking about China. Beijing is also to blame for Kenya's debt problems. Our next report brings you the details.
The situation in Kenya is the direct result of unsustainable debt. Nairobi owes a lot of money to a lot of different creditors, both internal and external. How much does Kenya owe in total? About 11.2 trillion Kenyan shillings, or almost $86 billion at today's exchange rate. That's the total debt. It's about 68% of the country's GDP. That is far above recommended levels, meaning that Kenya could default on this debt. And that is also why the government is desperate to raise taxes. It needs the extra revenue to repay its loans. Let's put internal loans aside for a moment. They aren't as dangerous to Kenya in the current situation. The bigger issue is external debt. Here are some examples of the external lenders: the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the African Development Bank, and of course, nations that lent bilaterally, like China. But they didn't lend the money in shillings. It was primarily in US dollars. And that is where the problems arose, because the last few years have seen Kenya's currency tank. In 2023, the shilling was in a free fall. It shed 26.8% of its value against the US dollar. That meant that Kenya's debt burden kept rising without it having borrowed too much money. Kenya's debt rose by more than $13 billion last year. And about 73% of this was due to the falling currency. That's almost $10 billion of extra debt. That is why Kenya's government is insisting on raising taxes, in case the shilling goes into a free fall again. The Ruto government is desperate to avoid a debt default. Look at Sri Lanka in 2022, or Ghana that same year, or Zambia in 2020. Now, what happens if a country fails to pay back a loan? First, it becomes harder to get a new one. Then the value of the defaulting nation's currency usually tanks, making imports more expensive, causing inflation to surge. Then there are usually shortages of essential goods, leading to hoarding, long lines, and public inconvenience. Kenya is already suffering from a weak shilling and high inflation. To avoid the rest of the problems, the government had to pay back its loans. A big Eurobond payment was due this year, worth about $2 billion. Kenya didn't have the money to pay it back, so it borrowed more money, and that too at a higher interest rate. Now you would wonder, if the big loan repayment was made, why is Kenya raising taxes now? Well, that's just one out of many repayments. Here's the list for the next financial year. About $660 million to the World Bank, about $650 million to the African Development Bank, $110 million to the IMF. But the biggest loan shark in the next fiscal is China. Kenya has to pay China $1.2 billion by the end of June 2025. And Beijing isn't known to be very flexible with its repayment schedule. That is why the Kenyan government under President William Ruto is desperate for more tax revenue. Last year, the IMF had described Kenya as an innocent bystander during the world's debt shock. Nairobi could not have predicted the COVID pandemic, or the war in Ukraine, or the resultant inflation and high interest rates in the US. All these factors caused Kenya's currency to tank, and its debt to spiral out of control, leading to the crisis that you see today.
cross to the West Indies.